Welcome everyone to the September focus series. Today we're focusing on enabling conversations on legacy. And I must say this is one of my favorite topics and conversations, especially, hearing about these conversations with clients, because there's something about legacy which is so unique to each individual. So I always say when you send out that discovery link, if a client selects legacy, that's really exciting because just by asking the client, you mentioned legacy is important to you. Tell me what legacy means for you. And you'll get a variety of answers from different clients because it always means something unique and personal to each client. And I always think it's a really insightful question because you gain insights into what's important to the client, what their beliefs are around that, and what legacy looks like for them. So great question to ask and bring in all conversations in conversations with your clients. But if we think about, some of the things that come up in those conversations, the range of answers you get from clients, I've heard things like, from a legacy point of view, I want to make sure my kids can study and not worry about loans. That's the legacy I want to give them, or I want to give them a good start or a start that I didn't have, in life. And that's the legacy. Or there's an organization or charity that the individual is really connected to, and that forms part of their legacy. And sometimes there's even generational, we have a generational legacy or generational transfer that we want to keep up. And it's important to the client to maintain or sustain that legacy through the generation. So always an interesting conversation, always insightful, to gain an understanding of what's really important to the clients. But if we think about legacy from a financial planning point of view, then we know it's a very broad conversation. We're talking about things like, is the will in place? Who are the beneficiaries? Who gets what? Is there clarity? Can we transition it in a seamless and easy way for clients? Is there enough to sustain the income needs of the dependents or spouses that are left behind? What about, providing for costs that might be incurred? IHT is one that's, coming up quite a bit at the moment. And how do we have conversations around different strategies around that? There's so much encompassed in this legacy financial planning conversation. So what we did for today is we sort of try to come up with a framework. Can we have a framework that we can use to ensure we're going through each of the elements of those conversations with clients, but also a framework that we can share with clients to help them understand all the things that form part of legacy. So this, we're calling the legacy hierarchy, and I'm going to go through each of the steps, but please, we welcome you to add, what would you change? What would you add to this framework? What are we missing something? And really to make it your own and create it together. But if we think about the purpose of this is to have that framework, not only for us to make sure we're stepping through the steps, but as a way of positioning it with clients to say, this is a broad conversation. It encompasses a lot. Let's make sure that we're going through it in an order that makes sense. And sometimes it means that you're going around in circles as well as things change and starting again. But let's just take a step through each of the steps in this pyramid. So the first one is around a living legacy. So if we think about, clients that are retiring, the first legacy conversation we want to have with them is around sustaining that lifestyle. What are their income needs in retirement? What are their goals and the things that they want to achieve? And maybe part of that is, not being dependent. So how do we ensure that they can sustain that lifestyle and have that living legacy? So that's sort of the first step in that conversation. But then once we've determined that, then the next step is what we're calling sort of seamless transition. And the thinking behind this step is that, in those times where there's, an unexpected death or a death, how do we make sure that at least from a financial point of view, there's a seamless transition? And that's having conversations around, do we have a will? Is it in place? Is it up to date? Where is it? That we're all aware of that. It's a conversation around providing clarity around what goes goes where, who gets what that process will look like for that client at that time. And of course, there are going to be costs, potentially inheritance tax or other costs that are going to be incurred in the event of a death. How do we ensure that we've, had that conversation, understand what that is, and enable, how we're going to fund that with the clients? Then the next step in that is saying, well, in the event of a death, we also want to sustain the family and the dependents. So in other words, what income would your spouse need? How can we ensure that that income continues? If some things fall away in the event of the death of one spouse, is there still enough and sufficient to provide for the lifestyle of those dependents, either the spouse or additional dependents the client might have? Once you've got those things in place, then we can start thinking about bespoke requests. I specifically want this to go to that individual or this organization or these beneficiaries. Then we can start understanding the impacts of that. And that's again where it can be quite circular, because depending on changes there could impact the costs again. We might need to go back and work our way through the pyramid. And then lastly on the top is then we start thinking about, growing and sustaining generational wealth and the transfer of that. And there we start thinking about structures and trusts and how do we depict and enable that conversation. And I wonder if you've had experience like this as well, but I can tell from my own personal experiences in talking with just friends or family friends and their parents as they're about to retire. When you start talking about what does retirement look like and what are the options, they immediately start thinking about what's earmarked for their kids. I think it's just such a human, natural response. I've built this up over time. I want this to go to my kids. And hopefully this framework can help. So, you're jumping all the way up to bespoke bequests, but first we want to make sure we can sustain your lifestyle, your living legacy, and that there's a seamless transition, that we've had those conversations, that we can sustain your dependents, your spouse in the event of a death, and then think about, what are those specific bequests and wishes that you want to make sure we work through. So hopefully this framework helps in enabling those conversations, in working through that with clients, but also for us to think about, are we enabling all of these conversations? Are we working through it in a manner that, in an order that makes sense? And how does this loop around? So please share your input, give us your feedback. What would you change? What would you add? And let's create this framework together. Now, in today's session, I'm going to work through how the features in AssetMap can support the conversations at these different levels. So we're going to work through an example together. Probably not going to get to every level, because obviously this conversation is quite broad, but we're going to work through each of the rings on this pyramid. So I'm going to jump over into AssetMap. Let's take a look at an example. Right. Got a new demo client for today. So today we have the Millers. So we've got David Miller. He is 66. He's semi-retired. We've got Sarah. She's a little bit younger. And they've got 2 adult children, Josh and Bob. So if we take a look at their picture at the moment, while he is semi-retired, he is still earning some income. We know that there will be a state pension in the future. On her side, she's earning an income as a teacher, still working, and will also receive that pension in the future. They've got life cover. You can see the note there that it's not in trust. That has some impacts, which we'll discuss. They've both got pension funds that they've been contributing towards, and discretionary investments, with him having a share portfolio and her having an ISA. They've got a home, and they've still got a little bit of a mortgage on that they're paying off on that home. So if we think about that first tier in the pyramid, we want to ensure that they can secure their lifestyle. So with them being about to retire, we want to understand first and foremost, can we sustain the income requirements that they have in retirement? And of course, for that, I'm going to jump over into target maps. So the first thing we've done here is just worked on retirement itself. And if we look in their particular instance, working through it with them, they said the income they're going to need when they both stop working is around £50,000 per annum. And they want to ensure that they can have that till 100 and that it keeps up with inflation, in this case of 3% annually. What do they have that they can put towards that goal? Well, we know they're both going to start receiving those state pensions from 67. That will, of course, keep up with inflation as well. So we can bring that in to the conversation here. And we can see that the assets that they have available, we've included their pensions as well as the ISA and GIA. Haven't included the share portfolio, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But that gives us, the ability to answer that first question. If we look at that pyramid of can they sustain their lifestyle, that living legacy is the first tick we want to make to ensure that they can. And in this case, we're saying they have enough funds, it can last them to 100, bringing in that state pension as well as the assets that they have. Then if we think about the next step on that pyramid is around, that seamless transition. And here it's things like, is the will in place? What sort of costs will they incur? Is there clarity? Do we know who the beneficiaries are? And some of the features we can use to facilitate and enable that conversation starts off with legal here at the top. So in legal, we can add in their will. And we can add in all the specific important information about the will that we want to ensure that we've noted. So here I've put in the will, who the applicable members are, most importantly, where it is. It's located in their home office. So there's clarity around where it is and how we get to it if we need to. But I can also add in, beneficiaries and notes. So a specific note that they mentioned is that currently the share portfolio that David has is going straight to Josh and Bob. Obviously, that's going to have impacts, which we'll talk about, but the residuary of the estate is going to the spouses. So you want to be able to note any key details around the will, around any legal documents that the client has that you want to be able to access that could impact the planning. All right, so that's done here under legal. The next step that we want to look at is the beneficiaries. Now, you know that for all assets, incomes, life cover in Asset Map, you can go ahead and add in who the beneficiaries are. So for example, on the pension fund, I can go ahead and put in that will go to Sarah in the event of death. I can also do that on the home or any other assets. And for example, here, the share portfolio they've mentioned, that's going directly to the children. So I can go ahead and put that in here. One other point to note now under legal is because I've added the will as a legal document, I can tick here that it's eligible for beneficiary designation, which means that I can select it as a beneficiary on any of the assets, cover, or incomes, so that I can show which investments will be dealt with in terms of that will. So an example here is the ISA. I've added in that is actually will be dealt with in terms of the will. So you can go ahead and select that will or the individuals that things will be left to or it will be dealt with in terms of. And I can view all of that in the beneficiary reports. You'll see this report got an upgrade as well, where you can now see it really nice and clearly and visually. So I'm on David now, and I can see all the assets that are going to go to Sarah in the event of David's death, as well as the liabilities that will need to be covered in the event of death. And here we can see here's that share portfolio that's going to the two kids. Okay, the two adult kids. I can then flip over into Sarah and have a look at what it looks like in the event of her death, what assets are going to David, and then what we've earmarked that will be dealt with in terms of the will. This could be estate as well. You can name it whatever you prefer, but you can then allocate assets as to them as beneficiaries without it appearing on the top of the asset map as a member of the household. Okay, so if we think of that row in the pyramid, we want to provide clarity, show the client who the beneficiaries are. We want to add in the will, note that it's in place. If it's not in place, that's something we want to put together for them. The next question comes down to, well, what are the costs going to be? And here, this is where I can use target maps again to reflect that. So you'll see under this retirement target map, I've created 2 additional custom target maps. And I do that by just selecting new target map and selecting custom. I can then put in any name that I want to call that target map. So I've specifically talked about IHT in the event of David's death and IHT in the event of a combined estate or, a joint death. What would that look like? And then I can go ahead in here and add in under the what you want section, whatever that IHT cost is going to be based on the client's circumstances and their structure. So I've gone ahead and added that in here. Why is it important to do that? I think it's important because it shows the client really tangibly what that cost is going to be, but it also helps us open up and facilitate a conversation around how are we going to address that cost? How are we going to fund it? Because in this instance, if we go to the what you have section, we might say, this ISA would be enough to fund that, or maybe there's another investment that we want to earmark for that, and then we can go ahead and select that. Or it might open up a conversation where the client says, that's not something that I want to use to cover, IHT. We have something else in mind for that. And then we can start to build in strategies or plans around or implementing of other cover in order to address what those costs are going to be. And that's where that pyramid, again, can be quite circular, because one of the changes we can make that then change that IHT. But that's that second layer, is being very sure to show the client what is the inheritance tax going to be, if death happened today, based on the circumstances that we have. How are we going to fund it? Let's open up a conversation around how we're going to fund it, or strategies that we can to change that. Then we move to that next layer on the pyramid, which say, well, if we've addressed the cost, we've addressed that the client can sustain their lifestyle, what happens in the event of a death? So if we look at the event of a death for David, what sort of income would Sarah require in the event of death? And the reason this is slightly different to the retirement sustaining lifestyle is that some things may fall away, some things may change, income needs may change, but we want to show that in the event of one death of one spouse, that we can still sustain the income for the other spouse or other dependents. So here we can see that Sarah's income requirement would still be the same, that £50,000 per annum till age 100. What do we have to work with that we can include in that? Well, the one state pension might fall away, but we've got her state pension as well as the investments. Haven't included this in case we're earmarking that to cover the IHT. But again, this is the conversation and the trade-off conversation that we would have with the client around how we're funding certain things, and then fulfilling can we sustain the income of the surviving spouse and or dependents. Okay, so that's sort of that third layer. Then if we think about the next layer of that pyramid, that's where we talk really around, what changes can we make, or beneficiary or specific bequests that the client has. I want this to go to this individual. And in this case, we spoke about, that share portfolio going directly to the kids. But we can use features like relationship maps to show alternative scenarios. So here we could say, if we change that and we transfer, first goes to Sarah and then to the kids, that can then have an impact on the IHT and reduce it. Or, if we put the life cover into trust, or whatever those different strategies and options are that you're exploring with the client, relationship maps is another way that we can depict that, make it real and tangible for the client to show how we can, change that structure or that flow of where the funds are going. And then we can, of course, again, in that circular motion, go back into target maps to show the impact on, this is your IHT at the moment. But if we, change strategies, it goes first to your spouse, then to your kids. This is the impact and how we can reduce that. So again, just enabling these conversations with the clients around what is important to them, and understanding for each of those steps in the pyramid, have we had that conversation, and then working through it again to make sure that it's very clear for the client what those costs will be, how we're funding it, and whether they can sustain that income. Then we start thinking of that top layer. That's when we start looking at different structures or trusts and how the funds flow. And again, relationship maps can be a great way of illustrating that. So I'm just jumping into another client here. And you can see that on the screen. Yes, you can. Okay, perfect. But here, I just wanted to show a more sort of complex structure situation where there's trust and different individuals. But again, you can use relationship maps to show how that structure, what that structure is, and how that generational wealth will continue through those generations, through these different structures, and through beneficiaries, if that's, what we want to illustrate for the client. So just to recap on the different functionality, I'm going to pop back over here. We can, in the asset map itself, show the beneficiaries, show the legal documents, note that, show the impact of that in target maps, where it has a cash flow impact around what the costs are, what the income needs are we sustaining that? And then relationship maps is a great way for us to illustrate any changes that we want to make that could impact those costs and impact that ability to meet that need, but also to show structure and changes in structure to promote that generational wealth planning. Yes, I hope that helps in illustrating how you can use the features through those different steps in the pyramid. I'm just going to jump back to the presentation and just share that.
That just while
Share that.
Kirsty is doing it,
Yeah.
I think Kirsty, the thing that you touch on is what we're trying to do with Asset Map is not financial planning, but financial planning engagement. How do we make
Yeah.
this stuff that's very technical, very dry, very often clients have got no idea about these things. How do we make that engaging with for clients and create that financial planning experience?
Yeah, I love that. And it's exactly that. How do we make it real for them, where they can see it, where we can explore options together, arrive at what is going to be best for them. But just going through this pyramid again, using those features to show the world, using the features to show the beneficiaries, to show the impact of that in target maps, using relationship maps to show the structure and how we can make changes, I think really facilitates or creates that space to enable this conversation. But the most important is just asking a client, what does legacy mean to you? And from, whatever comes out of that, we can use those features to enable it. Even if it's specific requests, we can use custom target maps to show how are we going to meet those specific legacy goals that this client has. So please, yeah, share your feedback. Let us know, what would you add? What would you change? Is it helpful to have a framework like this to work through it with the client? And then, of course, using Asset Map to enable and those conversations. And then just before we end off, I wanted to give you a sneak peek at what is coming next. Our all our development is around how do we enable more meaningful conversations with clients. And we're really excited about the next enhancement that'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks called priorities. And what this edition will give us the ability to do is enable a conversation around what's important to the client. So often if you ask a client, what are your goals? It's a difficult conversation that they may not know off the top of their head, all the things they want to achieve. But what priorities will enable us to do is explore that with the client. What are the different things that you want to achieve? And how do we, assign sort of importance to that? Is it urgent? Is it important? How do we assign those levels to that? So priorities will help us explore it with clients, work through it, customize it, make it really personal for that client, and assign priority to that. And also just to check in, as we review the client, what have we achieved? What goals have we met? How on track are we for those? So we're really excited for this edition. The October focus series will focus on priorities and how to use it. So we'll share more there. But watch out for this one that'll be coming soon. Yeah.
I'm excited about this one as well, Kirsty, because it's just, I think it's going to open up so many opportunities to engage clients. And it's not just upfront, it's as you say, it's in that towards the end as well. How do we celebrate those goals and how do we remind ourselves of what we've achieved? So, yeah, so I think it's going to be wonderful for conversations.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll just pause it. If there's any questions, please let us know. Or if you have any feedback on that, or we'll work through any of those topics together, please let us know and we can, work through that with you.
Awesome.